recording is now started. How is language used as a space of identity, right? How is it language used to undermine the colonial empire and things of that nature? And these are some of the questions that Glissant is posing, right? And it kind of made me think of really two things, right? One, this idea or this notion of code switching, right? And then two, in the Black context or the African and American context, what does that look like? How does language play out, right? Because although it presents itself differently, because Glissant is taking up the question of Creole as being the undermining of the colonial language. But then I thought, from the African and American context, what is that undermining, right? What is another language that we can position? And then I thought back to like the mid 90s. And in the mid 90s, there was this really big move to situate Ebonics as a secondary language and to make that like an official type of secondary language. And what ended up happening is in Oakland, they really took this project on. And there's a sociologist from Nigeria named John Agbu who wrote extensive research studying this project that developed in Oakland around using Ebonics as a valid secondary language. And this idea says that, folks who do speak Ebonics are bilingual in a sense, right? They can speak your standard American English, and then they can speak the Ebonics vernacular as well. So we'll position them as being multilingual. We'll allow them to use that type of colloquialisms in the classroom. We'll infuse that into the classroom space, right? So this is a whole project that took place in the Oakland area in the mid 90s. So, I thought about that. And then I kind of thought about individuals who come out of Oakland. And there's something that I've noticed, they don't do the code switching, right? So I think about, if you're familiar with sports, you think about Marshawn Lynch, right? No matter what platform that he's on, he keeps his Oakland vernacular. He keeps his Ebonics intact, right? He doesn't code switch to a more professional diction or a quote unquote professional diction. I thought about Ryan Coogler in the movie production space. If you hear him give an interview, he doesn't talk like your typical professional, right? Is anybody familiar with the Bay Area? Anybody familiar with Oakland? Not too much. So if you've spent any time in Oakland, like there's a certain way that they speak. Like there's a whole language that is infused in the East Bay or in the Bay Area as a whole. And to me, the reason why they choose not to code switch in the Bay Area is grounded in this movement that took place in the early 90s that validates and authenticates this notion of Ebonics, right? So that fascinates me. And even in my pedagogy and the way that I go about my teaching, I try not to code switch. I try to use just a regular way that I talk and engage with you guys the way that I would engage with you guys outside the classroom. That's one of my methods as your professor, right? So what we'll do is we're gonna watch a video of Ryan Coogler. One of the importance of watching the video is like 10 minutes. It's just so you could hear this vernacular, you could hear this language that I'm talking about, right? And then also, if you listen to what's being discussed, if you listen to the content of the interview, this notion and this idea that Glissant takes up of relations becomes very transparent, right? So we'll watch that for 10 minutes. I'll kind of go over what I found of interest in the reading real briefly, kind of give you some context of Glissant himself, and then we'll break out into breakout groups, have you guys discuss certain components of the reading, come back as a complete class, discuss that, and then we'll call it a day. Does that make sense? Is there any questions you guys have for me before you watch the quick film?
I do. What you said about the 90s in Oakland, that's the hyphy movement though, right?
Yeah,
kind of? Okay.
Yeah, yep.
I just want to make sure.
Yep, same thing. Okay, give me 1 second while I share the screen and then we'll watch the video real quick.
One thing that was a central theme in the film was Black identity and this relationship between African Americans and Africans on the continent. Can you talk about what your relationship with the continent has been and, what you see as the reconciliation between Africans and African Americans?
mean, that's heavy, man. Like, I remember having a conversation about my own identity when I was very young, man. My parents had to sit me down and have a, your Black conversation. You know what I mean? And I think that it's a conversation that parents have to have in this country, and I think all over the world. Because it's a real thing. If you don't understand, not the fact that your skin looks like this, but if you don't understand the fact that the world is going to treat you a certain way because of that, and you have to be ready for that. It could cost you your life if your parents don't have that conversation with you. So I had that conversation at an early age, and what I found was, I was a curious kid, and so it's like, we African American, and I was big on why, like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? And so we come from the continent of Africa. We come from this place that you see on the map in school and that you see, on the globe at home. But I was in the Bay Area. I was as far away from the continent as you could be, and still find Black people. You know what I mean? Like, next thing you hit is Hawaii, I guess. You know what I mean? And I had a lot of pain inside of me due to not being able to, know my ancestry and only being able to access that womb. And what we were taught, not to be long-winded, but what we kind of taught about our own African American culture is that it's a bastardized culture. We taught that, we lost, the things that made us African. We don't have them anymore. You know what I mean? Like, we had to make do with the scraps. And when I sat down with Marvel and said, hey, yo, for me to write this script, I need to go to the continent. I need to go, like, right now. They were like, man, go. And I went and started in South Africa because, it was really because Chadwick and Civil War and Dr. John Conley, they speak Xhosa, the dialect on the continent. And I went, I started there. I started there, and what I found was what I found as soon as I got there, and I started, and I was by myself, and I was hanging out with cats that was working in a hotel, and they took me back to their township, and they were like, hey, let's go do the ritual. We're gonna go do the ritual. And I'm like, oh, ritual. So I'm expecting, like, painted face and I'm expecting to go all the way in. And what we pulled up at our house, and it was a bunch of young cats standing outside, you know what I'm saying? So I'm like, this feels familiar, And we go in and we walk to the house, and all the OGs, I say from age like 50 to 70 was sitting in one section. I'm like, that's what happens at my house on weekends. So we keep going, and we go into the kitchen, and the women are in there cooking, and they talking, and they cooking all this food. And then you go out into the backyard, and there's some more young cats, like my age, and they had just slaughtered a cow and a goat. And they were, cooking the food, and they were passing around this real cool African beer, and everybody was drinking from the same. It was like a exactly calabash. Everybody was drinking from that. They passing it back and forth, and I'm like, man, what ritual is this? And they was like, oh yeah, this I can't remember the name. We've been doing this for thousands of years. And I was like, well, we do this same ritual back at home. And then for them it was a no-brainer. It was like, yeah, of course you do, because y'all African, And I realized then, I was like, oh wow, yeah, right, because whatever this evil thing that happened to us, you know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, they don't teach us anything beyond that, But what they did to us, there was no way they could wipe out what we were for thousands of years. You know what I'm saying? And it was right, something right there just made me completely whole. Like I was like, oh man, we've been African this whole time. When I stand outside, like when I hang with my family on the block in Oakland or Richmond, and all the youngsters stand outside, and my grandma's inside cooking, you know what I'm saying? And we being Africans, and even though we were told it was being hood or it was being something else, we was being true to what we've been for thousands and thousands of years. So I felt connected, in a way that was very profound.
Give him a round of applause, please.
All right. So, Ben, just kind of give you a little bit of context in the sense of what I was talking about as it pertains to like this dialect that they have in Oakland, right? Like he doesn't sound like your typical movie producer, even your black movie producers, right? They don't talk like that. They sound more like, you know, you're buttoned up, you know what I mean? So there's a difference that you hear there. And to me, there's an importance to that, right? There's a move that Glissant is attentive to in the reading that Ryan Coogler embodies. Also, again, as I mentioned, in the context of what was being talked about in the conversation, right, the content of what they were discussing, this idea or this notion of relation becomes prevalent, right? And he says, you know, irregardless of this thing that happened to us, that separated us, right, we're still African, even after thousands of years of being removed from that. This Africanity is still within us, it still resides in us. And that event did not disrupt our cultural integrity, our cultural ingenuity, right? So think about that and keep that in the back of our minds as we engage the work of Glissant. The book is called The Poetics of Relation. So one, it's important to understand what a poetic is, right? So if we were to think about a essay and an actual poem and we were to like merge those two together, that's what a poetic is. And the significance of this, it allows you to play with the form of language and be a little bit more fluid in the way that you're able to manipulate language, right? And that's why the poetic form becomes important, right? It gives you a little bit more leeway. You don't have to be as structured and as buttoned up as you typically would if you're producing just your typical essay, right? So that's one thing that becomes important. But the core of what Glissant is up to is this idea of relation, right? And he starts the book out with a chapter called The Open Boat. And I didn't want to overwhelm you guys, but I think it's important that we kind of address this because it sets the tempo and it sets the context for everything that Glissant is up to in the subsequent pages. And just to give you a brief overview of what The Open Boat is, he describes this boat as being pregnant, right? As being a belly that's pregnant and is housing these individuals. In fact, let me do this. I'll just read the opening paragraph to kind of give you an idea. For the Africans who lived through the experience of deportation to the Americas, confronting the unknown with neither preparation nor challenge was no doubt petrifying. The first dark shadow was cast by being wrenched from their everyday familiar land, away from protecting gods and a tutelary community. But that is nothing yet. Exile can be born, even when it comes out of a bolt from the blue. The second dark of night fell as tortures and deteriorations of persons, the results of so many incredible guinas, and that's a word that they provide a definition for in the glossary, because this was originally written in French and it was translated into English by Betsy Wing. So guinas is a hell, a place of fiery torment, right? So he says the second dart of night fell as tortures and deteriorations of persons, the results of so many incredible guinas or incredible hells or places of torment. Imagine 200 human beings crammed into a space barely capable of containing a third of them. Imagine vomit, naked flesh, swarming lice, the dead slumped, the dying crouched. Imagine, if you can, the swirling red of mounting to the deck, the ramp they climbed, the black sun on the horizon. So that's just the opening page to this chapter called The Open Boat, right? And then you probably can't see this, but where it says the Americas, you see like a little star at the end of it, right? It provides us a footnote. So what the footnote lets us know, the slave trade came through the cramped doorway of the slave ship. leaving a wake like that crawling desert canvas. It might be drawn like this, and he has like an image of something like, I'll show you. He says it may be drawn like this, and that's the image that he gives us there, right? Just to kind of show the route of the Atlantic slave trade, okay? African countries to the east, the lands of the Americas to the west. This creature is in the image of a fabril. African language become deterritorialized, thus contributing to the creolization of the West. So this becomes important, right? African languages become deterritorialized, thus contributing to the creolization in the West. This is the most completely known configurations between the powers of the written word and the impulses of orality. The only written thing on the slave ship was the account book listing the exchange value of slaves. Within the ship's space, the cry of those deported was stifled, as it would be in the realm of the plantation. This confrontation still reverberates till this day, right? So this is this thing that he calls the open vote. But what really becomes important is this portion right here. The African language become deterritorialized, thus contributing to the creolization of the West, right? So we gotta kind of take a step back and think about what he's up to as it pertains to a historical context, right? So he's articulating this phenomenon of enslavement, right? So we have Africans being captured in West Africa, right? So maybe coming from Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Gambia, all throughout the western coast of Africa, right? So these individuals may speak Akan, they may speak Wolof, they may speak Yoruba, they may speak Hausa, right? They may speak Igbo, but they're all gathered together on the bottom of this slave ship, right? And they're in the abyss and they're in the unknown. They don't know what they're going through. They don't know what's going on, but they desperately want to find out, right? So they're chained together, stacked on top of each other, right? And he says, you know, lice beings swarming, vomit, naked flesh, the dead slumped, the dying crouched, right? The swirling red mounting to the deck, right? So the blood is so much that it's overflowing to the deck of the ship, right? But these are people who are still trying to make sense of their circumstance, right? And the only real tool that they have is their orality, is their language. But again, you're chained to someone who does not speak your language, right? So you're still trying to communicate. And you're still producing a new language through this circumstance, right? And he goes on in the essay and he talks about, you know, one form of the abyss is the bodies that get thrown overboard because it's weighting down the ships. So to lighten the load of the ship, they throw cargo overboard, and these cargo is Black bodies, right? So he says, if you're able to survive this first abyss, and you make it to the unknown land, which is the Americas, there's another abyss that you have to suffer through, and that's the actual institution of enslavement, right? Doing the labor of enslavement, right? When you're on the plantation grounds, okay? So, but keep in mind this idea of relation, right? So in this hellish circumstance, there's a linguistic relation that's being formed between these two ethnicities trying to communicate to one another, right? Then they're brought to the soil, they're brought to the plantation, and depending on where they land, so if they land in the Caribbean, where a lot of the colonies were French, French gets infused on top of the mixture of Wolof and Akan and Yoruba languages, right? If you're getting transported to the Americas, then English is being imported into this conversation. So now we have a mixture of Wolof, Akan, Hausa, and English, right? So that produces a certain type of language, a certain, what we may call pidgin language, right? But when we go to the Caribbean, it's infused with French. So then we have the production of this Creole language, right? So what Glissant is trying to get us to be attentive to is not the act, right? we all agree that slavery was probably the most inhumane act that took place on the face of this planet, right? But that's not what's important to Glissant. Glissant is attentive to the relation that is produced from this event, right? We could all agree that colonialization is probably one of the worst things that happened to these continents who had to experience colonialization. But again, Glissant is not so much worried about the act of colonialization. He's concerned, he's attentive to the relations that get produced from these colonializations, right? So the relation is what becomes important. Hence the title of the book, The Poetics of Relation, right? And if you think about the two passages or the two poetics that we read, the first being creolization, right? So think about what I just articulated as far as the languages producing this Creole language, right? And then this notion of the tower. And think about this idea of relation. And that may allow what you've read to make a little bit more sense, right? And it may allow it to be a little bit more reticent and clear to you. How many of you guys are familiar with like the French Caribbean, with New Orleans, Haiti, or just even this notion or this idea of Creole culture? Does anybody have any experience with Creole culture or Creole identity? Is anybody in the class Creole? Okay. Have y'all heard of gumbo? Gumbo, all right. Could you kind of describe to the class, Brett, gumbo, the best that you can? And if not, I can fill any gaps.
From I'll say the roux, I've most likely
Mhm.
the spices and the combination of meats that go in there.
Yep.
It's very distinct and it stands out.
Yeah.
It's very, I guess, very specific to a certain group of people that were somehow fused together to create that sort of dish.
So thank you, because you used some terminology that I was really looking for, right? So one, he talks about the roux, right? The broth, right? And he talks about the spices that get combined to, yeah, we're recording, we're good. Okay, yeah. So we are recording. So he talks about the spices that make up this roux. And then he talks about the combinations of various meats, right? But then the specificity to a specific culture, right? So gumbo is a Creole dish. You go down to New Orleans, it's something that's very popular down there. But what it is it's like a broth, right? It may be a veggie broth, chicken broth. You put various spices in there. You'll put sausage, you'll put shrimp, you'll put lobster, you'll put all these seafood dishes. You'll put rice, right? A little, some bay leaves go in there. And then you just let it sit and simmer for hours, right? And the combination of all the different spices, all the different meats produces just this very distinct flavor, right? This is the idea of Creole, right? This is the personification of what Creole is. You have all these varying cultures, all these varying language, all these varying nuances, but they produce this one fundamental culture, which we call Creole, right? So that time that the gumbo sits simmering, that is the relation, right? Because that allows all the flavors, all the spices, all the meats to kind of melt together and produce one syncretic flavor, right? So this is what Glissant wants us to be attentive to, this idea of relation. Now, we've read Aimé Césaire, we've read Frantz Fanon, and now we're reading Edward Glissant. So they're all from this island of Martinique, right? They're all Martinique, which is a French colony. So again, as I mentioned, the book was originally published in French. It had to be translated to English, and it was done pretty recently. I want to say 2010 was the translation, and the original publication was in 1997. So it's fairly contemporary, right? So a couple of things that do stand out, right? We have the juxtaposition between the written and then the oral, right? We see that in the text play out. And then this idea of native languages and this idea or this notion of universality, right? And how there's a conflict between the native language and the universality at play, right? So those are two things that kind of play out that are conflicts here. And then again, I can't stress enough this notion of relation. And if you read, you see the word relation pop up several times throughout the text, right? So he's being very explicit, like I need you guys to understand this idea, this notion of relation. And then also this term orality, right? What is orality? What does he mean by that? What is he trying to get us to think about as it pertains to orality? So I'm going to put a pause in my speech. From here, what we'll do is we'll jump into breakout groups, and what we'll discuss in the breakout group is this notion of relation, right? And then we'll be discussing our journals. So what do you guys think Glissant's thesis is in which you read? His method, do you think his method was effective? Do you understand his thesis through his method, right? Or do you feel that his method was confusing or opaque? We're also going to discuss how did you guys make an analysis of what you read? So how did you make what you read make sense, right? And ways that you could take what you read and apply it to today's society. So that will be our conversations throughout our breakout groups. It may be a good idea to just have your journal with you because you could pull directly from your journal to have that conversation. But don't forget to also discuss this idea, this concept of relations, because it becomes important, okay? Is anybody unclear as to what we'll be discussing in the breakout groups? I'll give you guys about 15 minutes. Let's see. We'll have about 4 to 5 people per group, so there'll be 7 groups. Again, we'll give you guys about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and we'll discuss as a class what was discussed in the groups. Please assign a spokesperson, so that way when we come back from the groups, we already know who will be doing the talking for each group. We'll lead in with the spokespersons, but then it will evolve into an overall group conversation. And then once we exhausted that conversation, we'll call it a day. Is there any other questions, comments, or concerns you guys have for me? And everybody understands the question's pretty straightforward? All right, bet. So I'm gonna put you guys into breakout groups. We'll have about 15 minutes and then we'll come back and discuss. So please remember to discuss relations. Please remember to provide a spokesperson for each group, okay? I think everybody's back. All right, they're coming. So we should all be back now. Again, you should have assigned our spokesperson for each group. I don't know who those spokespersons are, but for group 1, Brandon was in that group. So whoever was in Brandon's group and who has assigned the spokesperson be your group 1. Group 2, Matthew was in that group. I don't know if Matthew is a spokesperson, but whoever was in Matthew's group and has been assigned the spokesperson, your group 2. Group 3 is Wendy's group. Again, Wendy may not be the spokesperson, but whoever is in her group that has been assigned the spokesperson, you're for group 3. Group 4 is Angel's group. Angel may not be the spokesperson, but whoever has been assigned to be spokesperson that was in Angel's group, you're for group 4. Golden's group was group 5. She may not be the spokesperson, but if you were in her group and they assigned you to be the spokesperson, just know when I say group 5, that's you. Group 6 is Thelonious' group. He may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was in his group and who was assigned the spokesperson, you're group 5. Group 6. Thelonious' group is group 6. And then Jade's group is group 7. Jade may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was in her group and who was assigned to be that spokesperson, that's you for group 7. So for group 1, which is Brandon's group, who was the spokesperson? We'll start off with you guys.
I'll talk for our group. I guess to start off, page 103, and then I'm just gonna read it.
Okay.
At the top, it's real quick. Either you speak a language that is universal or on its way of being so, and you participate in the life of the world, or else you retreat. I guess taking away from it and from what I wrote, and we kind of agreed on, is take America, for example, if we're talking about now, is you need to assimilate to only speak English. Mm-hmm. And if you do speak English, you better not speak broken English. Because if you do speak broken English, you still do not belong to this community. And I think for that, we're talking about Eurocentrism and breaking away from it. But at the same time, it also says that I guess you would call it the abstract, the very, very first page about your identity doesn't define you, but in another way, it contributes to the whole. Yeah. But going back to it, seems like it was intended, it's a closed-minded approach, but it was intended only for a certain group of people to be in this community that spoke English a certain way. And in reference to the colonies, mm-hmm. when they first arrived here, anyone else there didn't belong to the group. And how English is considered to be the normal language. And for me, as I was thinking when I kind of mentioned it, is when we talk about this community and being part of the world, you essentially could create communities where you allow dog whistle politics, speaking to an only group of people in code because you don't want to include those people in your community. So.
Very good point. What did you guys discuss as it pertains to relation?
We had mentioned about, or someone had mentioned let me scroll down here, where it talks about, some brought up the categories, the domination of relations itself, mm-hmm. and how he really broke it down, the relationship of fascination and also multiplicity, mm-hmm. and subversion and mockery. But really, I guess in relation, you're kind of forced to be a part of a group, or else you'll die alone by maintaining what your culture is, because suddenly now it's not applicable to civilization or society. But for me, it took me 2 times to read it, yeah, to really understand what is Glissant really trying to say. And like you said, it's a combination of poetry and academic writing.
Yeah, I agree, Brett. So when I had to read this book for seminar, and we went chapter by chapter, I always had to read the chapter twice. And then even for this class, I read it a couple nights ago, and then I read it the hour leading up to course, just to kind of get a clearer understanding of what he's up to. And then there's also a rhythm to his writing that once you've been reading it for a little while, it becomes a little bit more transparent what he's saying. I had to read the whole book. So for the first quarter of the book, I was completely confused. But about halfway through, I started to kind of pick up on the rhythm. And by the time I got towards the end of the book, I was just really in flow with Glissant's writing. So you do bring up a good point to where you kind of have to engage it a multitude of times to really get the understanding. So thank you for group 1. Group 2 was Matthew's group. Who was the spokesperson for group 2?
Yeah, so I'm the spokesperson for the group. So for our group, we kind of got the idea that the whole idea of the chapter was kind of like the whole idea of dismissing what's different, and how like if it's not proper, if it's not right, then like, oh, like it's not worth looking into. Like it just does, it's not like it's, oh, like it's Creole, it's not real English, so don't pay attention to it. And we kind of took that in like how now, like with our family, like we were talking about like our family who like we speak Spanish, but like the more generations go down, like less people like they stop speaking Spanish, just only speak English. And like that whole idea is like being lost, and like, oh, we don't need to speak Spanish anymore because we're in America, we just speak English. But it's still important to us because it keeps the ties with our family, it keeps the ties with like where we came from, and how this, like, just remembering the language, remembering how the language became, or like how like it started up and how it connected us was important. And it's by losing that connection, you're also forgetting the past, you're forgetting like where you came from, and like you're assimilating to the 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 greater language, I guess, to be the, or like the proper language of like America or like wherever country you're from.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, right? And I like the way that you situated English and Spanish, because it's like, you know, as we stay on American soil, actually, I don't want to phrase it that way, because really American soil is Spanish speaking soil. But anyway, as you reside within in this country, and English continues to get forced on you, you detach from your native language, i.e. Spanish, which Matthew articulates also separates you from the connections to your family, right? So if Glissant is concerned with language, yes, he's writing about differences, but it's a critique of difference, right? He's not necessarily agreeing with the way that things are being, these demarcations are being drawn, these borders are being drawn, and these separations are being created, right? He's saying, yes, these things happen, but I'm critical of them. I'm critiquing these things because my emphasis, I'm concerned with relation, right? So to Matthew's point, it's important to keep your native language so that way you don't sever your relations with your home family, right? So he's critiquing the difference to make us attentive to the importance of relations. So you bring up a very good point there, Matthew. Group 3 is Wendy's group. And again, I don't know if she's the spokesperson, but whoever is the spokesperson for group 3.
I'm the spokesperson. So we did think it was a little, we were a little like confused because the text is like you have to reread it to really understand. But what we took from it was that he keeps mentioning languages kind of as a tool, was used as a tool for domination. And we said that in the past, because we kept talking about the Oakland movement that you brought up, and we said that in the past, you know, like with colonialism, they used language as a tool to force upon people, and they still do it today. But that movement was like reclaiming their vernacular back, kind of like I'm sorry, I don't know his name, the director for Black
Ryan
Panther.
Coogler. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, where he said, you know, you're clinging on to whatever you have left, you know, whatever was taken away, you're trying to take back and hold on to. So that movement is really powerful, we were saying, because it's like, you know, you don't have to, because people will say, oh, like, don't speak that way. Like, even if it's not like a language, it's like the way like you're like that group speaks, you know, it's their vernacular. So like in order to tell them don't speak that way, like it's like taking away that culture. I don't know how we came to this. We were talking about on page 105, we saw like relations of polite subservience. And that is exactly like what that is, like forcing a language on someone is like, oh, well, you have to be so proper to like conform to society. So in order to be like scholarly, you have to speak a certain way, you know? And we talked about, I don't know how we got here, but we talked about kind of like we brought it toward media, where there's certain things that are expected on television, like a way to speak, a way to be, and then certain imagery, because it talks about like subservience or mockery. we brought it to kind of like a deep level with kind of like imagery used in Gone with the Wind with Hattie McDaniel. You know, like that negative stereotype of like happy to serve the white dream. And then she's not even allowed to go to the premiere because, you know, so we thought we brought it there, and we were saying like that it kind of had to do with a lot of this, like taking away that identity or putting up false fronts of like certain things, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good because almost talking about tropes, right? Like how Hattie McDaniels fit a particular trope, and then that form of the identity is acceptable to be translated into Hollywood mainstream, but other forms of identity we don't want to deal with. So yes, that's a very good point. Do you want to add any more, Tori, or are you good?
No, yeah, I was just gonna say like you, that's good because like that's the only thing that people will see as like the identity of someone like Hattie McDaniel, you know? They'll only see that negative stereotype unless it's changed.
Yeah, and then by extension, that is extended to Black people, right? So Black women are only viewed from that context, right, to serve. So yes, that's a very good point. Group 4 was Angel's group. Angel may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was the spokesperson for group 4.
Oh, I am.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
So I plug another microphone. But so we're talking about like the analysis of the thesis of the text, like the importance of language in forging or creating a national identity. And the thesis in the reading is that the language is just not the dominant universal language, and it should be communicated a chance for sharing and equality. And well, we brought like examples of, and I was thinking of like early like colonizers, like the Romans, and like how like they went on and like conquer, you know, like half of, you know, if not all Europe, and like how Latin was the language and Greek and Latin. But then like that language became like Italian, that language became like Spanish, Portuguese, French. And even then here, like in the US, like now as a Latino, like Spanglish is like, you know, very common to me. Like there's certain words and things, you know, expressions that we're talking that, you know, we use as a, you know, Latinos with Spanglish. And I was looking at this meme, you know, that's what I do lately. So it's a meme that says like, you know, how like everybody here from America, like speaking English people want to travel around the world, but they refuse to learn any other languages or investigate about any traditions. They just, you know, want to go and like, you know, they only speak one language and they're not willing to like even like have that little book with like, you know, the translations or. And we put an example of like deadlocked country, like in Mexico, how like, and this is a question, like how there's so many native languages that are restricted to just Spanish, killing the native tongue, and how is that moral? Was one of the questions that Angel proposed too.
I like the posing of the question, Alejandro. And I don't know if you're looking for me to answer or if it's a rhetorical question, but to me, what the question shows is just being critical of the, being critically engaging the text, right? But if you are looking for me to kind of answer the question in regards to how did Spanish stomp out the native languages, I mean, it's no different from the way that English has stomped out the native languages, or how English in the American context is currently stamping out Spanish, right? It works in the same fashion to where Spanish was the dominant language. So whatever your native language was is gonna be, you cannot use it. If we hear you speaking it, you will be abused, right? Like the Catholic schools, the missionary schools would literally beat you for speaking your native language, right? So that's one of the mechanisms that causes for these native languages to be stamped out. We read in Googie, right? Because I have two different classes. I want to make sure that I'm talking to the right class. But we did read in Googie, correct? Okay, so we didn't read in Googie. So there's a African theoretician named Thiawango Ngugi, and he talks about how where all these African writers were brought to a conference for African writers who write in the English language, right? And he was like, yo, this is a fundamental contradiction because, and what he says is, as an undergrad, I was invited to this conference, right? But my mentor, who is one of the top renowned poets in Africa, right? But he only speaks in Senegalese. He only writes in his native language. But he is my mentor. He's a Ph.D. holder, and he is recognized as the most well-known poet in Africa. Cannot attend that conference because he does not speak English, right? So that would be the equivalent of one of y'all being able to get to this conference as an undergrad, right? And I'm your professor, but I can't go because I don't speak English, right? But I'm more credentialized than you, I'm more recognized than you, and I'm more intellectual than you because I hold a PhD, right? But because of you being able to speak English, you're afforded to go to the conference and I'm not, right? So the value being placed on English also devalues the native language. So that's another way that Spanish is used to stamp out these native languages. We'll place more value on that. So if you want to write a book and you want people to buy the book, you better write in Spanish because they're not going to read that native shit, right? So these are other ways that they're able to kind of make us, even as native speakers, devalue our native tongue. Does that answer your question, Alejandro?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great point. For group 5 is Golden's group. Again, Golden, you may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was assigned the spokesperson in your group, it's on there.
I'm the spokesperson. Most of the time we actually spent discussing on page 105. Glissant brings up relationships of subversion, and I'm just going to read the first
real quick, Golden, before I cut you off. One, thank you, because you're in my head. I meant to read this as it pertains to Alejandro, because he talks about Spanglish, right? And when he said that, I thought about relationships of subversion. So from that, go ahead, Golden, because that's a great transition.
So this part it says relationships of subversion exist when an entire community encourages some new and frequently anti-establishment usage of a language. And what we were discussing, we were mostly relating it to our own experiences and understandings of language and how different communities we have seen or interacted with have not, even though we're technically using the dominant language of English, we're using it in different ways that kind of subvert it, either if it's African American vernacular English or we just have different dialects that expose our cultural identities. And we were also discussing ballroom culture of queer individuals in New York in like the 70s, 80s and such, and how a lot of that language has recently been repopularized. And we've been seeing those phrases pop up, especially like online. But we are kind of like confused on where we like stand on that, if that's a completely good thing or a bad thing, because a lot of the instances of using this language that was rooted in very marginalized communities that were able to use this language because they found a community that celebrated their identities that would otherwise have left them oppressed in the larger community. But a lot of individuals that we see using them now are like young white individuals who don't connect that experience of oppression and struggle with that language, and they are able to use this language in a way that rids that history. And oftentimes I've seen people credit the history of those phrases to like different online communities like Stan language or like Twitter language. So it kind of just like completely erases all that history of pain and such. So yeah, I don't know if I spoke too much.
No, you was dropping bars, but you speaking hella fast. So I hope everybody caught what she was saying, because she really dropped some nugs. Like you was really on point, Golden. So she's absolutely right. But and what she's being attentive to is to the capture of the subversion, right? So when these communities produce these vernaculars and produce these colloquialisms, right, then mainstream will come by and adapt these languages and these vernaculars, and then they get credit for those languages and their vernaculars, not giving credit to the group that originally produced them, right? This is what Golden is being attentive to, right? But she's absolutely right. And to me, this notion of subversion is kind of where I sit and where I love to play and I think about how do I become intellectually subversive, right? So as a scholar in a PhD program, how do I undermine the authority of the academy, right? As a scholar who is in front of classrooms and teaches, how do I undermine this supposed normative professionalism that should go along with somebody who's obtaining a PhD, right? And as I kind of mentioned earlier, the way that I speak is a form of subversion, right? The fact that I fucking cuss in class is an act of subversion, right? And it's an intentional method that I use to undermine the respectability politics of the academy, right? But at the same time, it comes with some sacrifice, right? So if I go into a job interview talking like that, that may not lend me that position, right? So you have to be wise and when you choose to be subversive. So you may get me speaking professionally in an interview, but let me get that job and come the first day of class, you're gonna get a different me, right? So it's being wise in your subversion. So that's a very good point. Did you want to add anything else, Golden, or were you good? Okay. So for group 6 was Thelonious's group. Thelonious, it's you, Crystal? Okay.
Yeah. So again, trying to keep it all in the topic of like relations and how language, trying to keep on that theme. We were talking about kind of like the thesis of this whole reading, and kind of echoing what people have already said. Like language is a tool, and it's related to like every aspect of your life. It's used as a tool to dominate, to seclude, but as we also just discussed, it's also used as a tool to rebel and to subvert. And that's kind of what the whole reading is sort of about. He kind of lays it out like, literally in these bullet points that we were talking about, hey, this is how it relates to domination. This is how it relates to, stereotypes, which someone else talked about. This is how it relates to like subversion. And he even goes in and talks about like the minutia of oral and written languages. And so, I think you had already said it, like, it's related to you whether you want it to be or not. Like it's kind of forced on you. So like I guess for the thesis, I circled this sentence. It's on the very first 103. The first page. It is the language of a community that controls the main vector of its cultural identity, which in turn determines the conditions of the community's development. And again, I feel like that's, he kind of lays all that out throughout the reading. Like this is how it's used to dominate, and this is how it's used to push against that domination. And then sort of the other questions we kind of answered sort of like full pronged, kind of like the method he uses and how we understood it, like how we took it, and then relating it to modern times. We sort of answered that as sort of one like multi-pronged kind of. So like as far as how we made sense of it, I had to read it multiple times as well, because like I understood that he's talking about, the importance of language and how it has like an impact, but what exactly is he saying about it? So we definitely had to do a read through of it. But like, so when he's talking about, how important language is and how it's, like I just discussed in relation to domination and whatnot, Sam and I, to kind of make sense of it and kind of relate it, we kind of, I think Alejandro already brought it up, kind of, we grew up in Southern California. So we were thinking of, like Spanish is like that. Like here in Los Angeles, there's different forms of Spanish, there's different dialects and all that. She was talking about, she grew up in San Diego, and there were kids who would come across the border to school that spoke Spanish and English, and and how they were even looked down upon. So again, using language to sort of, dominate and seclude, like talking about like there were teachers that would look down on these students that didn't speak perfectly English. Thelonious was talking about how he made sense of it and how he related to it. Growing up in Detroit, he kind of like with Oakland, kind of spoke, a different dialect. And then when he kind of moved to a more suburban area, kind of, being poked fun at for not speaking the correct, vernacular and whatnot. And so that's kind of how we were sort of like making sense of the reading, kind of relating it to like, okay, that's kind of how like what I've seen in my own, personal experiences. And like relating it to, again, modern times, I noticed he brings up technology, because he brings up how we have this tendency of like, there's this universal language that tends to try to like dominate. And so in relation, I noticed like 3 different areas he brings up kind of technology as that point. And my husband's a computer engineer, so it kind of made me think of like, oh, kind of like, in this digital age, technology is becoming ever so important. I think the UN has now classified the internet as a human right or something like that.
Wow.
And I know there's a problem with, like, for example, coding.
Right.
And for stuff like different forms of technology being discriminatory. Of course, what comes to mind is facial recognition technology. And you look and it's like, oh, it's because all these coders are like white, mainly white males. And so again, it kind of made me think like, oh, that's kind of like what's happening here in the digital age. And that kind of got us talking to what Golden was just talking about, how even in the internet age, there's a lot of like culture being like appropriated and used, and like she was saying, not giving credit to where that came from, and it's kind of being erased. And I don't know, that kind of made me relate it to the reading when he was talking about how like written and oral languages, and how like oral languages, they're at a, kind of a disadvantage, because if it can't be transcribed to a written word, all it takes is someone to stop speaking it, and then the next person stops speaking it. Yeah, and then it goes from there and becomes a lost language. And yeah, so that's kind of how we sort of like we're trying to tie it all together, and we answered the second part sort of like kind of together. It sort of like got the ball rolling.
Yeah, that's dope. In the chat, technology. Tyler says technology is a form of language in its own way. Absolutely. I don't know, again, so mind you, I'm in a PhD program, right? And we read this, and no bullshit, no cap, I'm gonna be like so 100 with y'all. Your level of analysis to break this down, and I'm speaking to the whole group, like, is so far beyond people in my PhD program, man. Like no bullshit. I don't know what it is. I really can't even quite put my finger on it. But like, sitting in the courses with other individuals who read this book, who are in the PhD program, and their inability to deal with the abstraction of the themes in the book, it was profound. But then seeing how you guys are able to make sense of the abstract, to me, is like, either y'all hella smart or they hella dumb. You know what I'm saying? I don't know where to situate my understanding of this, but like, hats off to y'all, man, because you guys are really engaging the material, and you're really making sense of it. In the it's a lot easier to digest something as a group. This is true. But to your point, Leonardo, like, we were in groups too, right? So I'm discussing with groups, and I'm like, y'all motherfuckers ain't getting this. So I don't know. But more importantly, salute to y'all, because your level of analysis is supreme. Also, you mentioned, Crystal, you're looking at the universalization, and you're talking about technology. And to me, when I read his thoughts on universalization, globalization came to mind for me, right? And as globalization gets more prevalent, English language gets more prevalent, because you want to have one unified language that all communities can speak, and that allows for trade, and allows for commerce and exploitation and technological production to be manifested, right? So he's also very attentive to the expansion of capitalism, right? And he has a chapter in here. It's called The Black Beach. And he talks about how technology is beginning to overtake the island of Martinique, and it's causing the island of Martinique to lose its uniqueness and to lose its native essence. So he's very attentive to the way that technology is impacting and shaping culture. So that's a very good point that you guys brought up. Also, how Thelonious mentioned, living in certain parts of Detroit and then going to other parts of Detroit, there's a separation in the vernacular, right? So I'm a California person, like Southern California, for like my whole life, right? But I did spend some time in Tennessee. I went to go play football. Now there's a vastly different dialect from Southern California to just the South, period, right? And they was telling me like I speak like a white boy, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. But when I heard them talk, I was like, I don't even know what the fuck y'all saying, right? So like, you're not even speaking English. So the difference in culture, right? And they have a different diction, a different way of speaking. You know, so a popular component to Black vernacular expression is like cutting off the last syllable, right? Or cutting off the last letter in the word, right? It's something that's kind of popular, right? To me in the South, they just cut the whole fucking word in half. Like you just get the first half of the word and the rest of that shit disappears, right? So there's a difference in the way that even, and these are Black people speaking to Black people, right? It was at a historically Black college, but just there's a regional difference, right? They said, I speak proper, right? I'm saying the whole word, right? So for example, there's a sister that came up to me and asked me if that was butter. And I didn't know what the fuck she was asking me. She was like, what it sounded like to me, yo, is that butter? Is that butter? Is that butter? And I'm like, what? Is that butter? She's like, yeah, butter. I'm like, oh shit, bitch, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, right? You cut the word in half, right? I'm saying it's butter, you know what I mean? But to them, that's speaking proper, that's speaking white, right? So the regional component is vastly different. Again, there's a certain Southern LA accent that I'm attentive to, right? Like the way that people talk in Inglewood is different from the way that, and I'm talking about Black folks here, right? And the way that Black folks will speak in the IE, there's a difference, right? It's more pronounced and it's more exacerbated when Black folks from Southern LA and then Black folks from Northern California, right? There's a difference in the way that they speak. So there's also this regional difference. So yes, I'm glad that you guys brought that to the attention also. The last group is group 7. Jade was in the group. I don't know if she's a spokesperson, but whoever's the spokesperson for group 7.
Yes, I'm the spokesperson. So when we were discussing the thesis, we all were, like everyone, overall confused about the reading and how dense it was, or I don't know. But yes, like his overall speaking, getting his point across was like the idea of relation. And for me, like what stemmed from relation was like, yes, like was communication, but also like this shitty thing happened and kind of led us all to led us to have the ability of like a universal communication, you know, it kind of makes you ask like what is what we have now, like is it a good thing, but what we got from it was something really shitty, you know, like institutionalized race or institutionalized slavery, if that makes any sense. Yeah, just because it was like pretty confusing for us to, and I was trying also to like listen to everybody else's analysis of the thesis, and that's what I could come up with for the thesis, or like analysis of his thesis. When we talked about like what made it make sense for us, I brought up the first quote that you see, the live in seclusion or open up to the other, and that instantly made me think about, and I was telling them at my job I'm the only white person and everybody else speaks Spanish, and for me, I've like in my head, I'm a white person and I can choose not to learn the languages of literally everybody else except for me, and I could feel secluded, and I could he mentions it in other quotes, like says the same thing but in other quotes, but I do choose to, you know, ask my boss, how do you say this, or even just learning it from hearing it every day for 4 years. You know, I'm diving into like this other culture and this other language, which I think is like a good thing, and more people should do that. And then Luis also kind of like said the opposite of this, which like he took that quote as like a more negative type of thing, and he said like it was kind of like the colonized are forced to learn the colonizer's language, you know, like they've been, you know, like it's, sorry, that's like it makes sense both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, like,
Yep.
you know, other people are more open-minded, and then other people don't have a choice but to learn this language, and especially like since they've been, you know, colonized. Sorry, but and then I was thinking about it and how it related to like in today's, and you can agree or you can disagree with me, but for me, I feel like I've been to Japan and I've been to Thailand, and like I've noticed that they are more willing to learn like the English language, and I don't, like, if a Thai Japan person came here, I don't know any Japanese or I don't know any Thai, and I like it. The honest truth is that, you know, I haven't gone out of my way to learn that yet, and I feel like aside from like people who can speak a lot of language, like the people who don't choose to, like you see that like going to other countries where they're more willing to learn the English language than America is to learn other different types of languages. Yeah.
Yeah, Jay, you that was very profound, right? And like what popped to my head listening to you is the notion of positionality, right? And there's actually a term by this feminist theoretician, I forget her name. What's her name? It lost me. If it comes back, I'll bring her up. But what she calls it's called positional knowledge, right? And there's a knowledge that you gain from your positionality. And really, Jay provided us a perfect example of that, right? Because she said, I read this and I thought about myself, and I thought about myself at work, where I'm the only person who does not speak Spanish, right? And I could either choose to live in seclusion and only speak English, or I could get down with the group and start to learn the vernacular they express themselves in, right? But then on the other hand, Luis read this and says, as a colonized individual, your choice is either to get down with the language of the colonizer or live in seclusion, right? And they're both absolutely correct. And the only thing that makes the viewpoint different is positionality, right? That's the only thing that separates. So Luis is aligning himself more to the position of the colonized, right? By default, Jade, by her identification, by default, is aligned with the position of the colonizer, right? But she's attentive to be aware of her position and her situation, right? So it's a situational positionality, okay? So she says, in my particular work situation, I am now been morphed into this minority role, right? Because I'm the only one who don't speak Spanish. So now this applies to me in that circumstance, right? Which is brilliant. And when you talk about an analysis, that is the personification of analysis, really on both Luis and Jade's end. Although the outcome is seemingly different, right? It's seemingly different. Also, this is a great example of relation, right? Because Luis and Jade view this from opposite ends of the spectrum, right? But they have the same conclusion in the way that they assess the scenario, right? Even though they view it differently, they're on seemingly opposing ends, but their analysis and the final production of their analysis is a relation, it's an alignment, right? And that example is what Glissant wants us to be attentive to, right? How can you take things that seemingly don't work together and bring them together, right? How do you take things that are as Jay said, shitty experience and make something beautiful out of it, right? This is what Glissant is trying to get us to think about. Also, did anybody think about the title of the chapter, To Build the Tower? And then also as it pertains to the way that he ends the chapter, did that anybody register to anyone?
Yeah, our group, the Bible, the Tower
of Babel.
Tower of Babel.
Yeah. So explain that parable in the Bible for me, Brett. The Tower of
What
Babel?
it was is everyone wanted to build a tower to heaven and to the stars into heaven, but then God came down, he struck everyone down, and everyone ended up speaking a different language. and they didn't know how to communicate with each other. So they kind of formed their own communities of the people that spoke the same language as them.
Yes. And so that also is a theological story to explain why we have different languages, right? So that's also a move that the Bible, King James, tries to do, right? So that's the premise that he starts the chapter off with, to build the tower. But then how does he end the chapter? So the last paragraph. On the other side of the bitter struggles against domination and for the liberation of the imagination, right? I'm trying to liberate your imagination. This is what we're talking about. There opens up a multiply dispersed zone in which we are gripped by vertigo. But this is not the vertigo preceding the apocalypse in Babel's fall. So this is Babel is the tower that Brett is talking about, right? It shivers of a beginning, right? So something about a beginning that could be produced, right? Confronted with extreme possibility. So this beginning is confronted with extreme possibility. So what he's talking about is the possibility of a new beginning, right? It's possible to build the tower in every language, right? So where the Bible says, because of the separations of languages, this tower won't be built. But what Gleason is saying, it is because of the separation of these languages that we can construct this tower, right? Because it's the relations that will be produced by the separating languages to work on this one project of this tower that's going to allow for this tower to be birthed, right? It's going to allow for this new beginning to be created, right? So really, this is Gleason's project, right? How do we take all of our differences, different languages, different cultures, different foods, different ideas, right? And build this tower, or build something new, or birth this new beginning, right? And what he's arguing is the only way that that could take place is through this notion of relation. So I'm gonna kind of give you guys some insight into an existential ideological crisis that I have, and then we'll open up for class conversation, and then we'll call it a day. So I am, as I mentioned, I got my bachelor's from Cal State LA. I got my master's from Cal State LA. Both my bachelor's and master's was in Pan-African Studies. For my bachelor's, I combined it sociology, so I did a double major. And then for my master's, I combined Pan-African Studies and education, right? So in the realm of Pan-African Studies, there's a certain, so we talked about Eurocentricity, right? Pan-African Studies works from an Afrocentric paradigm, right? So we're gonna focus on the experience of Africa and African people to help explain the world, right? So along with that, which you guys got some insight into, the realization that African people were the first people on this planet that could be dated back 8 million years old, right? There's a whole civilization that was birthed in Africa that really birthed the European civilization, hence the Greeks and Romans, right? So these are the understanding that I'm being brought up ideologically under. So I get to Claremont, and Claremont introduces me, and I may have mentioned this before, but it introduces me to this notion of modernity, right? The modern, when Europeans kind of took over, and things that transpired after that point is considered modernity. Black folks in modernity have been enclosed into this thing that's a non-being, right? Their purpose is to be enslaved, is to serve as the other to whiteness, right? There's this theory that is produced by this Black scholar out of the University of Irvine. He teaches at the University of Irvine. His name is Frank Wilderson, and it's called Afro-pessimism, right? And this theory speaks about this notion of the perpetual death, right? So the existence for the Black body within modernity from an Afro-pessimist framework is the perpetual death. So our purpose here is to die, right? So mind you, I'm coming from this Pan-African background. I get to Claremont and they're talking all this Black death shit. And I'm like, what the fuck are y'all talking about, right? What do you mean that I'm not human? We're the first people on the planet. So how am I not human, right? My very existence alone, that I'm breathing, that I'm talking, that I'm producing, confirms my humanity. So how are you telling me that we're not human, right? So I'm struggling with these things. But, you know, I'm reading these theorists who are birthed out of modernity and things of this nature. I'm being scholarly about it, although I disagree. Then I started looking at empirical evidence. Started looking at Black Lives Matter. I just like you guys, we went through this crazy ass summer, right? And I have to be critical and I have to use my intellectual analysis. So let's just focus on this movement that's Black Lives Matter. Let's focus on the claim that Black Lives Matter, right? So to claim that or to make that pronunciation means by default, Black lives don't matter, right? Because if Black lives matter, you wouldn't have to make the claim that they matter, right? So even this movement situates our inhumanity, right? The claim of the movement, the articulation of the movement affirms the inhumanity of Black bodies. Breonna Taylor, the verdict for Breonna Taylor, right? So the wanton charge, by default, what that says implicitly is the wall, the window, the building has more of a right and has more value than Breonna Taylor, because he's not charged for killing her. He's charged for recklessly shooting into the apartment building, right? Damaging the apartment and then endangering those who occupied white bodies that may have been in the other apartments that got shot, right? So by default, Breonna Taylor's Black body does not matter, but this property does, right? So again, letting you know that it doesn't matter, right? The Black body doesn't matter. So now I'm like, well, shit, it would be a fool and it would be unscholarly of me to just do away with this data and this information and the evidence of the reality of our inhumanity in this condition, right? But then I started to teach this book to my African oral tradition class, and I'm reading this relations and I'm reading creolization, and I'm thinking, because at the moment that I'm having this realization that, yo, we don't matter, I'm having an ideological and existential breakdown, right? So I have a whole ideological and intellectual career that's based on the argument of our existence and the automatic assumption of our humanity, right? Or the reality of us being the original people on this planet. My whole intellectual career is based on that, right? So from my undergrad all the way up into this point of my PhD, this is my ideological belief system. It has just been exploded, right? So now I'm like, going forward, what do I do? You know, and I really don't want to move from the paradigm of our inhumanity to me that doesn't serve a purpose. But then again, as I mentioned, I revisit Glissant. And so now the project has come for me. How do I produce relation out of these seemingly opposing viewpoints, right? So if we are to take this notion of Black inhumanity and just put it in the category of Afro-pessimism, we'll just call it Afro-pessimism for sake of conversation, right? So how do I take Afro-pessimistic thoughts and Afro-pessimistic theory and combine it with a Pan-African thought, an Afro-triumphant thought, and produce new ideological material, right? So that's the subject, that's the project that I'm taking on, moving through Glissant's notion of relation, right? So I lay this out to show how you can even use relation from an intellectual standpoint, right? How can you take seemingly opposing ideas and theories, or seemingly opposing theorists, right? Like thinkers who you don't think get along, and bring them in conversation and bring them the theories together to produce a new theory, right? So now for me as a scholar, I'm thinking about what's the new theory that's going to be produced combining Afrocentricity, Afro-Pan-African thought, and Afro-pessimism. What is the new relation that can be produced out of that, right? So this is an example of ideological, intellectual relation, right? So I'm curious to hear some couple other thoughts from people who read and that we didn't hear from, just a general overall conversation about the readings. Even if something simple like, yo, I didn't like that shit. That's cool too. Like I'm open to that. You don't have to like everything that you read.
I have something.
Go ahead, Luis.
I mean, well, I was talking to my group and Uh, it was honestly, it was by far one of, I guess you could say, one of the shortest reads that you've given us so far. But I don't know, it hit me in a place where I was just like, I was fired up, but then at the same time I was like, dude, this is true. This is how, being here in the States, if you're not like American, or if you're not white or light skinned, it almost seems like you don't matter, period. No matter if you speak the language correctly or not, to them, it doesn't matter. And it's something to kind of like what Golden and Crystal brought, like, and also Jade, when she said like about trying to learn a language. When you go travel, when you try to do something different, or you go out and about to a different country, conscientiously, you never want to try anything. You're like, oh, okay, let them conform to us. Let them speak my language. Maybe like that, it'll be best. But in my mindset, I was like, it shouldn't be like that, like it should always be like, if we're going to their country, we should at least try, to speak to them and make them feel at ease, because you don't know how those individuals might feel. If like they might be scared, terrified, or anything, because we don't know how they're living and they don't know how we're living. So how I take it is sort of like I was in this I think it was like a semester, 2 semesters ago, on a Chicano studies class, where our professor talked about in Panama, the difference in Panama and the difference in Belize, how sometimes, even though you're from like different countries, you share a lot of the similarities in their culture, and also sometimes without even knowing their language. And it was one of those strange things that I was just like, it's so true, because like me, I was born in Mexico, so we have the dialect of Anahuac. So when I kind of spoke a little bit of that to a friend of mine who's from Belize, he kind of understood it, which is like, okay, how can you understand that if you've never, you've never visited Mexico, or you've never like spoken? He's like, it's just a dialect. There's similarities in the way that you use the tongue, and you don't realize, but there's more relationship there than there is. And it's one of those things that I was always just like, man, like it's so true, like they want, well, people of different countries, or especially here, they want you to just be here doing what they want you to do, their language, and you kind of tend to forget everything else. At least in my household, my parents always were aware that like, nope, you got to learn both languages, and that's it. You got to learn English, and you definitely have to know Spanish. The Nahuatl just came from my grandparents, so my grandparents were like, you got to know it, like, because if you do come back and you visit us, we don't want you to be a stranger. That's how I viewed it. It's like, man, even in my own country, I would be seen as a stranger. I'm like, to me, it just like, it made me like, my blood was boiling. I was just like, damn, dude, like, how can I explain this? Like, how can I even like come to realize something that's more than just a language? And the truth is, it is more than just a language. It's life. It's a way of living, not just for me, but for everyone else that's living in the States or living in a different country. We're all just trying to communicate in our own way, but to find a common place where we could all live in. And that's what I took from it. I was just, to a certain point, I kind of like got a little speechless after like reading it. I ended up reading it probably like 3 or 4 times. And the more I read it, the more I was just like, oh man, I don't want to read it anymore. It's just telling me more. It's just telling me more. I was like, but
yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, I agree with you, Luis. It kind of had that visceral effect on me as well, especially for me, because like you guys read a little bit of the open boat portion of the book, But like, if you really get into that chapter, it provides a very visceral response. It hits you, it's like a punch in the gut, you know? And then to me, the freedom found in the notion of relations, right? And just focusing on the connections opposed to the differences is a very liberating tool, right? And it's a very liberating way to approach a lot of things, because we're trained here in this society to focus on the differences, but there's so much more if you focus on the connections, right? And to me, that's really profound. Anybody else?
I kind of wanted to bring up something that I thought of just now. It's like we kind of see this in kind of like deaf culture, where like the world kind of revolves around hearing people, and they expect people who are deaf to get cochlear implants, or like they force like these different things on deaf people, but like it's a culture, and like it's like doing that is just taking away from that culture. I don't know, I just thought of that. But also I was thinking about technology and how that like language, it can be used as a tool of domination, because I read this article about I forget who wrote it, it was a while back, but it was basically kind of saying how people will judge, like for instance, if someone had like a iPhone, and they're like, oh, but like, why do you have an iPhone, you don't even have money, like they judge that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like, well, nowadays we rely on technology, how do you expect someone to not have a phone, so like it was just kind of like, I was thinking of that, like, yeah, it's used that way too.
Yeah, and then too, like, to take that back to this notion of globalization, right, is like you're so assuming that everyone has this technology, right, that when you think about parts of the world that doesn't, right, they're are automatically pegged as primitive, right? But on the flip side of that, we don't know the mental health ills or even the physical ills that's going to be produced from this technology, right? Like, so one thing that I think about, and I have them too, right? Like, I have an Apple Watch, I have the AirPods, but that's literally radiation that's being transmitted from your ear to your wrist into your pocket, like literally. And studies show that the radiation that your phone gives off is the equivalent or higher than the radiation from a microwave, right? Think about that. The radiation of a device that you carry in your pocket on a consistent basis exudes more radiation or equal amount of radiation than a fucking microwave, right? So now we have devices that are tethered to your wrist and tethered to your ear that uses smaller doses of radiation, but some people just walk around all the time with their Bluetooth attached to them, right? So I'm gonna be curious to hear in the next 20 to 25 years what cancer of the ear is gonna look like. Wrist cancer, what is that going to look like, right? Just because now we're having these technology to make things more convenient for us attached to us, right? But when a lot of these countries that we would deem remote, they may not have those health issues, right? I'm just thinking about the moment that we're in where everyone is isolated and everything has been forced to be made digital, right? Like, what type of psychological effect is that going to have in the long run, right? Like, how will people be impacted by not having a physical communication for this time and having to be forced to do everything remote, right? And then for people who for their leisure, it's video games, computer gaming, and things like that, right? So your break from the world is the virtual space, but now your world in the virtual space has been collapsed, right? So what type of mental effects is that going to have on people, right? So a lot of these things that we buy onto as progress, as convenience, as modern, right? We don't know the impact that it's going to have 10, 20 years from now, right? So Tori, you bring up a really good point. Tyler, I think you want to say something.
Well, I was in Jade's group, and I don't know. I mean, the reading was cool. it was cool. I just went through it, and what I got from it was one thing, or that Crystal said, well, the opposition between written and oral, and like how it affects communities and which one is more popular than one another. And I think I found I don't know, I found the most, when I went through one of the most appealing things in the text that I found was when it says the defense of languages assuring diversity is thus inseparable from restabilizing relations among communities. How is it possible to come out of seclusion if only 2 or 3 languages continue to monopolize the irrefutable powers of technology and their manipulation, which are imposed as the sole path to salvation and energized by their actual effects? And when I read that, I was kind of like, damn, like what? Like, I mean, I get what he's saying, but then he also kind of like went deeper into it when he was talking about it later on, like the last part of the text, almost when he was talking about how the Japanese computer company was investing considerable sums of money to like study several African languages. So like that type of stuff kind of put into perspective when he was talking about the power of language through technology and that aspect. Because I knew that like technology is its own language in its own like realm, how it's its own thing. But when he's explained it like that, I was like, oh, okay, he's talking about it in that type of form. Like it's bigger than just like Twitter and Instagram and shit like that. Like it's like, you know, I was like, oh damn. But also it was kind of funny what you're saying, like just languages in general. Like, you know, when I was with me, Jay, I don't, she probably forgot about it. I think we were talking about it, how she was saying like the situation she was in at work. Cause you know, I've been in situations like that too. You know, when you're in Southern California, you got to know, man, like shit, Spanish is the #1 language here more than English. You better get right. You feel me? Like, you know what I'm saying? And, but you know, when you in that situation, it's what you make out of it. And I was telling her like, that was go back to what you use with the analogy with gumbo. Like you in that, it's like you in this, the gumbo's like the workplace you in, and you have all these different spices and flavors. And in LA, it's not just Spanish people too. You know, you might be working with a Persian person, Armenian person, you know, that's the great thing about LA and like these type of this city and other places. Like it's a very cultural place. So that's what makes it so special and so flavorful, like you got these all type of different people from different backgrounds, different languages, different aspects of the world that come here. And you have to be the person to make the most out of it. You're the person, like we were talking, how she said, you have to be open-minded and like, you know, be vulnerable to the point to be like, I want to, you know, learn and get to know that. And also like just language, how you guys were also talking about how language within, not just like languages in English, Spanish, French, you know, Portuguese, like that, language within your own people is another big thing, how you were talking about. And I think someone else was talking about, I think Luis was talking about with the Spanish and this, you know, Latin American, how they have different languages in different places. That's a big thing out here too. Like, man, I shouldn't be saying this, but like me and my homies always joke around like how like, you know, you got every area you got your own language, but you know, we be saying like you got your black people, like your brothers who speak they black, and then you got your Africans, like they language, like how their English is, and then you got your niggas, like how they speak they language, like, you know, that's how it be, you know. And the thing is, it's like it's up to you to be able to like, I got homies from all those different backgrounds, I got homies that like, you know, their family are straight from Africa, like they parents nigga came from Africa, and like, you know, but their English is like, and the funny part is like, that's the type of like, I kind of like, that's another funny thing I'm about to say too, because one of my homies, like a whole family, they're from Ghana, and their whole family speaks the language. And I asked them, I'm like, bro, y'all don't speak it? They're like, nigga, what the fuck? Like, you think we speak that? Like, hell no, we don't speak that. I'm like, damn, like y'all never wanted to like learn the language, son, but like
the native language.
Yes, like they were born here in America, but like their whole family's from back there. But I asked them, you feel me, like first I'm like, damn, like y'all never thought about like, you know, like trying to learn, like, nigga, what we look like, bro? Like I'm like, damn, that's crazy, you know. But I'm sure now when I think, I shouldn't say I'm sure, because I asked my boy the other day, I was like, he's like, yeah, I feel like, you know, I should have like, you know, when you get older, now you think about it, because all his older sisters, they speak it, you know, they all speak it. And it's like the same thing in Spanish. I got a homie who just started making Spanish music, and he's making music. His music is good, but it's like, he kind of know, he speaks the language a little bit. I'm like, bro, you're Honduran, like your whole family from there. Everyone, you got like 10 brothers, they all speak Spanish. How you the only one that don't speak Spanish, bro? But his sister helps him out and he makes the music. And that's crazy to me. Like, you know, when you get older, you know, like you get wiser and you grow and you just like, you look at it from a different perspective. But when you know, you have to hold on to that root. I think everyone has to hold on to that root, that foundation, that ground zero, that base where your family comes from. And then, you know, you just, you know, you take it from there, you know, you make the most of what you can.
Yeah. And I think too, just think about, you know, the example you provided with the brothers from Ghana, like when you're growing up here, right? And I'm speaking from a place of knowing, because my fiance, she's from Eritrea, right? It's East Africa. I think her 2 older brothers were born there, and then her brother right above her and herself were born in the States, right? So when you're coming up in the States and you have those ties to Africa, let's be real, you know how Blacks in America can be, right? Especially for those in the 90s who came up, the boys in the hood, African booty scratcher, right? So now you're being ostracized because of your culture. So all you want to do is what? Blend in and be like everybody else. So it's easier at that point to take a disavow to your language, to your culture, because you just want to be Black American, right? But then what tends to happen as you get older, it's like, well, you see the value in your culture, right? And it kind of shifts the way that you look at your place in this world. And you got to see like, yo, all of this really ain't shit. And I have more cultural value back home than what I've been presented as a culture here, right? And again, I'm just pulling from just the experience of talking to my fiance, talking to her brothers as it pertains to the being in between both worlds, right? And then I thought about Luis's point, and he was saying how, you know, his language ties him to his home, right? And he doesn't want to be a stranger home, right? And to me, glissant ties language and identity, right? They're synonymous. And that's speaking to Luis's point, right? Because think about what it would be for Luis not to have connections to his home, but then not to feel at home here. You're placeless. You know what I mean? And for me, as I consider myself an African in America, I don't buy into that African American shit, but I've been cut off from my language. I've been cut off from my religion, right? So I don't have access to that. So I do feel very much placeless, right? America shows me very clearly that you ain't no real American, right? And I don't have the ties to ground me back to my continental ties, right? Unfortunately for me, for my children, right, we could partner them with Eritrean culture because their mother has that background, so it gives them some type of tethering, but I can't give them that foundational base, right? And Glissant says, you know, from a Glissantan's perspective, let's not worry about what was lost. Let's think about the new relations that's been built by you being here, right? A new relation is your household, right? I have an Eritrean and Black being brought together to produce a new relation, right? And that could only have taken place because of the slave experience, if we are to look at it from Glissant's paradigm. We'll have one more comment, then we'll call it a day. I don't want to put you on the spot, but Lilia, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, just because one, you're abroad, right? Like you literally read this not on US soil. So I'm assuming that you probably read this from a different perspective because, you know, you have experiences being in US soil and then living abroad. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the reading and how it, you know, affected you, affect with an A.
So from the reading that I found it really interesting was from page 106 when he was talking about like monolingual countries and bilingual countries with their internal or external problems. And so for the monolingual countries with external problems, I would say like that paragraph or that sentence means like the language can represent a country's culture and its people's like personalities, and also can he connects it with like economic, the country's economy. And then I feel like so monolingual country with external problems, I tied it with my country, Japan. I think excuse me, I think I don't know, like I think the one thing that I came up to mind was like when, for example, when there's like a conference or like some sort of meeting between the president or top of the each countries, like their English is like the most, like the necessary language. And then also like I don't know how to put it into like words, but what I want to say is like I think language can represent the person or the person's background in a good way and bad way. Like, for example, if you speak, yeah, let me think more, sorry.
Okay.
I just want to try to figure out like what I was gonna say. Because I'm sure I had something in my mind, but I kind of forgot while I was listening to everyone's opinion.
And I put you on the spot too, so it kind of it's a little unfair to you.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking while I was reading it. So and like while I was listening, how a lot of like people in our culture. Well, I'm Salvadorian. We speak Spanish, but like after a long time living here in America, we stopped learning Spanish and just kept with English. So it made me wonder, because the reading also brings up technology and how like language is affected by technology and how we need the language to progress. It just made me wonder how in the future we're gonna learn languages, because they're developing technology so that anything can be translated into a different language. So it's like, what languages we'll be learning then? Will it be us choosing the languages that we want to learn, like back to our original languages? So for me, it would be Spanish. Or would we all just stick to like keeping or learning new languages?
Yeah. That brings up an interesting point, Isaac, because like I don't know, for y'all who have iPhones and follow like Apple and shit, right? One on their latest update, then they give you like a built-in app, and it's a translator. Like off jump, you don't have to go to like Google Translate or anything like that. There's a little app that they placed on your phone to where you could just automatically translate whatever language you want. And so when you look at the combination of language and technology, you know, to me, that's the intersection of that in a very profound way. And then to Isaac's point, right, as this technology evolves, you'll be able to have a choice of what you want to learn. And you think about, what's that shit called? What's the language software that they have, right? And they're saying you can learn the language in a couple of weeks. But things like that makes the variety of languages that you have access to much more broad, right? So yes, thank you, Rosetta Stone. Thank you, Fionn. But with those options being there, will the majority of people just stick to English, or will it add to a multiplicity of language being discussed? And that's a very good question to contemplate for our future. So what,
can I say something?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry. I just wanted to say something that I remember that what I was gonna say. So I remember how Jade was talking about she went to Thai and Japan, and how they're more willing to learn English than here in America is more willing to to learn other language. But I find it interesting how it's not like how English is perceived, like considered in Japan. Like here, there's a like serious discussion about like Japanese people not being able to speak English fluently. Like there are less and less people who can speak English in Japan, and then like the government or like some people are trying to figure out a way to how to teach English to Japanese people in like from the early stage of their life, like maybe like from like elementary school or like middle school. And then I find it interesting because I think like, cause they were saying like, okay, so English is like important, you gotta learn, like it's necessary to be like out, like to be around in the world. But I've like at that point, I thought like English is considered to be more superior to like other language. So like that also relates to what the reading was saying from early in the semester, like how there's a the grammar of colonial racism, and then that there was one element from there that's saying like the mania for hierarchy. And then like I find it interesting how like we as non-English speaker also like have that like Eurocentrism perspective in terms of language. Like we consider European language or English more like superior than like our language. That's what I found interesting. And also like how like people react, like Americans react to like certain types of language. Like for example, when like someone speak like French or Italian, they find it like attractive, like more attractive than like people speaking like some sort of like they say minor languages.
Yeah.
So that's what I found interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point because, right, like it's not always a question of just being bilingual, right? It's like, what other language do you speak? Because if you speak French, that shit's sexy, right? Like oh, that's dope, right? But you know, I'm Mexican, I don't want to hear that Spanish, right? So it depends on, and often it ties to Eurocentrism, right? Like if it's a European language, then it has a higher value. So that's a very good point. Go ahead, Tyler.
I just wanted to say, hearing Lilia say that's crazy because, you know, in the U.S., how she was saying how they emphasize the importance of speaking English here, like speaking like a different language is like not emphasized to that aspect how it is, I'm sure, out there. That's what, at least what it sounds like. It's more kind of just like, you know, an elective course, something you can take if you want here and there. But also I was gonna say that I read this article not too long ago in Sports Illustrated, and it was kind of crazy because it was talking about how like a lot of these baseball players that get drafted at like from different countries, from like the Dominican, Puerto Rico, and like Venezuela, and you know that source, they come here when they're young, like 16 years old, and they're playing in the minor leagues. They're not in professional baseball players. Like they're not on TV. We don't see them playing, you know, every day for like, you know, the Dodgers or, you know, the Yankees, whoever. They're playing like for the minor leagues, which is the lower level, and most of the places they're playing are like small towns, which are like, you know, country, and it's like not your normal place, and these guys are like they're culture shocked, and it's hard for them. Like it really made me think, like, could you imagine being like 16, 17, and like they kind of form this brotherhood, like all, you know, the Latin American baseball players, and within that system form a brotherhood, and they stick together, you know. I was reading some of the quotes. I can't remember, but I remember some guy was talking, you know, he was saying in Spanish, and they translate, like, he basically, like, they would choose who was going to pick to order when, like, you know, they're in like Alabama or something, you know, like they're going to choose like which one of the four dudes out of them is going to choose to, you know, say the order, because it's so tough for them. But that just puts things, and I was just like, damn, like, it's just it was a good ass article, and I just had to say that because it made me like kind of correlated with what we're at.
Yeah, it talks about relation, right? They had to have relation to survive. Yeah, absolutely. And then also in the chat, I want to kind of touch on what Joshua said, and then also Fionn. He talks about another form of language is creating art, right? And to me, this is important because Glissant emphasizes poetry in the piece, right? And that speaks directly to Joshua's point, right? Poetry gives you the freedom to play with language in a way that's not so structured. And that's why poetries and poetics become so important, because you're not restricted or you're not tied to this language. And really, it almost becomes, not even almost, it becomes art. To me, there's an artistic expression in Glissant's writing. It's a poetic flow to his writing, right? And that speaks to the point that Josh was trying to make. And then Fiona saying, you know, some words or translations just can't be directly translated, and there'll be misunderstanding. And to me, that goes back to, you know, some of the issues we're trying to describe African circumstances in English languages or any other type of conversion of language. Also, so hey, Josh, why don't you go ahead and speak on what you just posted, man?
Yeah, so just saying that, like, what made me really like connected to me was just like, especially how us being filmmakers or us just wanting to create art, like we express, like do art. Like I know a lot of like mentally disabled, for instance, like people, like kids with autism, like they use art to express themselves, and they use music to express themselves. And like that's like the only way that they can express themselves. And especially with like elderly and those with Alzheimer's, when they listen to music, it brings back memories, it brings back their identity. So I just really connected that, especially what you said with language, intertwining language and identity, is that when we create art, no matter what type of art we're creating, even if we don't really feel a relation to it, in some way we are connecting ourselves to what we're creating and placing ourselves within it, even subconsciously speaking.
Yeah. No, that's a really great point. Actually, that's a phenomenal point to end on, and that's a great way to tie the two intersecting conversations of the course together, right? This idea of media and this idea or this notion of social justice. So thank you for that. So going forward, right? So we kind of closed out our conversation around colonialism. We're going to go back into the text for the semester. We're going to read one chapter of that. So that will be next week's discussion. And then on the syllabus, it says that we're going to engage this reading for 2 weeks in a row. I'm going to remove one of those readings. So we will read next week's, but the following week, we won't have that. What we're going to do is a midterm review. And then, you know, I'll send out. So what we'll do is we'll have a midterm review, not this coming Friday. Sorry, not next Friday, but the following Friday will be our midterm review, right? On the conclusion of our midterm review, I will send out the midterm on Monday, that following Monday. So let me give you guys dates so I can be more concise about what I'm saying. So the 23rd will be our midterm review, okay? On the 26th, I will send out the midterm to you guys via email, and I'll post it on the Google Classroom site. And then you'll have to have the midterm submitted back to me by the 30th. So you'll have about 4 or 5 days to, actually, I'll do this. I'll send out the midterm on Friday after we conclude class, and then you'll have a full week to get that back to me on the 30th. So we'll midterm review on the 23rd. Upon conclusion of the midterm review, I will send out the midterm itself, and then you will have until the 30th of October to get that back to me.
Our journals as well on
yes.
the 30th. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Tori. So the first half of your journals will also be turned in with your midterm. For the midterm, it will be essay format. There'll be 5 questions. You only have to answer 3 of the 5 questions. So that's what we'll be looking at. And again, we'll do a review, so that way you guys will be abreast as to what information will be on the midterm. And then that will be that. Is there any other questions, comments, concerns before I close out?